Okay.
Happy Friday, y'all. Today we're going to finish chapter 11, Psychological Disorders, and then you're going to have a quiz at 4 p.m. and it'll close Monday midnight. Any questions about that? Okie dokie then. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, where were we? 30, 30. So we said that there are different categories of disorders. We've covered anxiety, and now we're on to mood disorders. And we left off with the symptoms of depression, depressed mood, reduced interest in almost all activities, overeating, not eating much at all, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, fatigue, tiredness, and difficulty with concentration. So, where does it come from? A lot of it comes from our genes. A lot of it comes from our experiences, especially as children. If we've been exposed to violence or childhood physical abuse or neglect by our parents, or sometimes it's loss of important relationships, and it doesn't have to be death. It could be divorce. Divorce is a big one. Um, even things like job loss, unemployment is a huge one. And then lastly, we get into these routines of thinking, these cognitive habits. Um, and so if you have like a pessimistic style of thinking, then that often predisposes you to depression when things arise. So, in looking at the biological part, it's specifically we're targeting mostly serotonin. Um, and so there are some sex differences. So, this is talking about a 5-HT. T is a transporter gene for serotonin. It's just the way we abbreviate it. Um, and people with the short form of this gene seem to have, and it says a short form of the gene may be more likely to respond to a stressful or traumatic event by developing depressive symptoms. So it's not the gene only, but compounded with, a stressful life experience, right? That could predispose someone, or it increases their chances of developing depression. We know that serotonin mediates our sleep, regulates our sleep, appetite, and feelings of contentment. And so we also see that there are sex differences, that men on average produce 52% more serotonin. So just by being female, you are more prone to develop depression. We know that estrogen alters the brain's sensitivities to serotonin because it activates serotonin receptors. So when a woman is ovulating and her estrogen levels are high, she's happy. And then when she's not ovulating, she's less happy. So if you have repeated experiences with violence, domestic violence, or maltreatment at home, and we know that stress causes the hypothalamic pituitary. This is not gonadal. Sorry, it's adrenal A, HPA. I wonder if I should try to fix that now. Let me do that now. Hold on, just so you guys aren't confused. There is an HPG axis as well. The hypothalamus communicates to the pituitary. Pituitary communicates to all glands. But in this case, we were talking about stress and the stress response. That's the adrenal gland responding by releasing hormones. Um, Hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. We know that people who are chronically stressed are going to be, essentially, putting out a bunch of cortisol until it depletes. But we know that high levels of cortisol impairs neuronal development, memory, and negatively affects mood. So what this is saying is that when you have these experiences, these life experiences, uh, your body responds in such a way that it, creates a hormonal response to stress or stressors, and that in itself will impact our central nervous system. Relationship loss, a history of separations, losses, rejections. Maybe you had an insecure attachment or an impaired attachment with your caregivers, the loss of a lifelong partner, like your spouse, um, loss of a best friend, loss of a parent, loss of a child, you name it, death. So the cognitive habits, the negative ways of thinking about one's situation. Depressed people believe their situation is permanent and uncontrollable. Right? So it's really about control. Do I feel like I have control over my life or what happens around me? And when we don't, when we feel helpless,
I just lost you completely for
yep,
the last few minutes.
okay. So when we have these feelings or thoughts that we have no control, we begin to feel essentially helpless, right? And hopeless. Rumination. These are depressed individuals who tend to brood about the negative aspects of their lives, even when they're asked to recall happier times. So what it means to ruminate is to always think about the bad things. Um, and when someone asks you, well, what are some good things that have happened to you, and you're still focusing on the bad. So essentially, what we've done is we've looked at um, the origins of depression, what could lead to depression. And we call this the vulnerability stress model, also known as the diathesis stress model. And the whole point here is that you have aspects of yourself, of meaning your experiences, your genetic predispositions, your cognitive habits. These are things that are about you, your personality. You take those predispositions, those negative experiences or biological uh, origins, and you compound that or you add that to a life stressor, right? An upsetting event like the loss of a loved one, the loss of a job, you failed at something, something traumatic happened, something violent happened. Normally, these things would lead to temporary unhappiness. But people with these individual vulnerabilities that are bringing, aspects of themselves to the table, it increases the odds of developing depression. So the point here is that just having a traumatic experience doesn't mean you will develop depression. Just having the short version of the serotonin transporter gene means that you'll develop depression. It has to have like these two components working against you essentially. So the vulnerability means that, some of us are more vulnerable to developing depression than others because of aspects of our lives, of who we are or what happened to us and so on in the past. And then you take the upsetting event now added to that, and now depression is there. So that's all about major depression, which is just marked by um, chronic depressed mood, right? A lower mood. Okay, but then there's bipolar depression. Um, Used to be called manic depressive or manic depression. And so here, what you have are those low moods that are counteracted with this extreme manic mood, this euphoric, high energy laden state. But what you need to know is that the manic states, the ones where people feel good, these are about a third to a half of the amount of time they spend in a depressed state. So someone who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder will be depressed for weeks, and then they might be happy for a few days, kind of thing. So during the manic state, people will develop or experience delusions of grandeur. That means that they feel that they are that they have that they feel that they are in control. They feel like they are in charge of themselves and things around them. They feel that they are accomplished. They're very proud of themselves. They think that they are bigger than what they actually are. And then you have the depressive state, right? And then that would be, the delusion of not necessarily persecution, but the alternate form of delusion, which is you feel like you're just worth nothing, low self-esteem. But the thing that stands out more than anything else in a manic state is this, not just this happiness. Don't think of it as like necessarily happiness. It's just all this energy. Where in depression, you have no energy. It's much, the opposite. It's fatigue. So with personality disorders, so we went from anxiety disorders mm, to mood disorders, and now we're moving to personality disorders, different category. These are maladaptive patterns that cause great personal distress or an inability to get along with others, and these pathological traits such as hostility or self absorption. Borderline personality disorder, intense but unstable relationships, impulsive behaviors, self mutilating behaviors, feelings of emptiness, and fear of abandonment. So, borderline and antisocial personality disorder are often like confused, but just think of like antisocial as in like you're breaking the rules, right? You're antisocial rules, right? So, antisocial personality disorder, irresponsible antisocial behaviors such as law breaking, violence, deceit, assault, irresponsibility, and other impulsive, restless acts. So, antisocial personality disorder is essentially it's these people are rule breakers with no regard for it. They lack empathy. Borderline personality disorder is often um, misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder and vice versa. Of all of the mental disorders that are commonly mixed up by clinicians, it would be those two, I would say, because the symptoms are so similar. These intense periods, the impulsivity, right? Those are the manic states.
Would the medication that you take for these be the same?
Yeah, usually they'll prescribe antidepressants. Yeah. Although with bipolar, you don't want to take an antidepressant, right? You
No.
want a mood stabilizer. We're going to talk about treatment in chapter 12, but right, you want something that's going to keep you down from the manic, but up from the depressive. So you want a mood stabilizer.
Zoloft.
Zoloft, yep. Something with lithium.
Yeah.
Question.
Yes.
Okay, why most of the time people take medication to fix a disorder like depression issue? Once we know the cause of this disorder, why don't you go back to the cause, fix the cause, and get back these people to the normal situation?
That is the goal for medicine in general, isn't it, Koku? That you don't want to just give a medication to treat the symptoms. You want to address what's causing the problem, right? Sometimes you can't fix the problem. For example, things have already happened. They've already been abused. They've already been neglected. They've already been assaulted. They've already been witness to violence or something bad in their childhood or in their past. You can't undo that. You can try because when we talk about the treatment, we are going to talk about cognitive therapies and behavioral therapies. So you're absolutely right. You want to try to address the cause of it. And in other cases, there is no maltreatment as children. There are no bad experiences. Sometimes it's just genetic, sometimes it's biological. And the cause of depression, let's say, is going to be providing a drug, a mood elevator, because there's nothing else around them that is causing it. But you're 100% right. That is exactly what medical professionals seek to do, address the cause. Well, let me say this again. That's what they should be seeking to do. Yes, you're right. Koku, what's your major?
Uh, I went to school for computer science and management.
should go into counseling, or because you know exactly,
Mhm.
or some sort of medical profession, because you know exactly what should be done. That's the goal.
Yeah.
Computer management, huh? All right, cool.
Who
Hmm.
did hold up a router?
That's true.
Ah.
That's true. Of all the things, yeah. I think he said it was a firewall.
I don't
It's a
know. I
firewall.
couldn't tell you the
Yeah,
difference between
whatever
the
that is,
two.
right? Exactly. I don't either. It looked like a router, didn't it? All right. So borderline personality disorder, emotionally volatile, moving from anger to euphoria to anxiety. They often threaten suicide, 10%, and they're self-injurious. And when they produce these self-imposed injuries, it reduces their stress, and it also solicits social support. So you have people who wear cutters, who cut themselves. Not only is it taking the mental pain and giving it physical properties, which reduces the stress mentally, it's also giving people, a chance to pay attention to them. Antisocial personality disorder. They are incapable of remorse, fear of punishment, shame, guilt, and empathy. They are often charming but manipulative, and these are more prominent diagnosed people in the Western societies or cultures. So some wonder, is it our culture that's engendering this prevalence, this rate, because we're individualistic? I don't care about that. Okay, so now we're going to go on to behavior disorders. Okay, so substance abuse disorders are behavior disorders. So essentially, this is how it works. Person, for one reason or another, often, in some cases, when they become addicted to opiates, because they were using it for treatment uh, after surgery for pain relief or analgesic effects, and they become addicted to it through no fault of their own. Some people will try drugs just because they're curious, right? But ultimately, what happens is when a person tries a drug, it excites a part of the brain, right? Depending on what the drug's effects are. It might be dopaminergic, it might be serotonergic, it might be acetylcholinergic, whatever. Okay. The brain has a nice level of stimulation, arousal. It knows what it needs to be as far as how often should this cluster of neurons fire. Because if this cluster of neurons fires too little, then we are understimulated. We become bored, depressed. If it's too much, like way too much, what ends up happening is neurons will die. They, it's called excitotoxic lesion, right? Meaning if they're firing too much, they're releasing too much neurotransmitter, and it's causing the next one to fire more and more. The neurons will become too excited. They'll kind of like burn out, right? And they'll die. So the brain has this mechanism to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay. And we also know that if neurons don't fire enough, they will also die, because there has to be some sort of um, movement. There has to be some sort of um, like it's like memory, right? They say if you don't use it, you lose it. What they're saying is the connections between neurons, from this neuron to that neuron to that neuron, and that cluster there, to recall what the color orange is or what an orange tastes like. If we don't think about that, if we don't use those neurons, that code together, eventually the neurons will kind of just pull back from each other and no longer stimulate each other. And so if that happens, if there's no using them, then they'll just die themselves. Just like, I'm not, what am I doing? Just taking up space, right? So the brain has this nice understanding I don't want to use, that's not true. The brain doesn't understand, but it has a nice mechanism for making sure that there's not too much or too little. So when a drug is taken, it's too much. Okay. Or some drugs, like an anti-anxiety drug, like a depressant, like alcohol, for example. Alcohol is a depressant. So that's too little. So what the neurons do in response to this too much or too little activity is they change themselves. So if a neuron is becoming overactivated or overstimulated because of, let's say, cocaine, cocaine will cause dopamine to stay in a synapse longer, and it causes the next neuron to fire, 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 fire. Okay, that's that euphoric, high energy result. Those neurons don't want to fire that much. So what do? They adapt. And it doesn't take long either. It only takes a couple of uses. And eventually, the neurons, what they'll do is they have all these receptors on their dendrites that are receiving the dopamine that are causing the neuron to fire. And they go, I'm firing too much. So it says, I guess I don't need all these receptors out there. So it starts to turn them inward, and it puts them on the other side of the membrane facing inward. So it's called down regulation of receptors. So then what happens is what normally should be a certain number of receptors out there for normal activity, for normal mood states and energy states, because it's down regulated receptors in response to the drug, when the drug wears off, now you don't have enough out there, but it keeps it down, right? And this is essentially tolerance. Okay, so tolerance is when our receptors turn from out into the synapse inside. They're still there, but they decided, look, I'm firing too much. So now my receptors are in here. So now when I take the drug, I'm taking the drug just to feel normal. When the drug wears off, because of the tolerance, what happens now? Withdrawal. Now I'm in a under firing state. So then we are motivated to get that normal feeling. And the tricky thing is, the funny thing is that people who start abusing a drug, let's not do that, but people who start using a drug, they get a high from it because all the receptors are still there. So people are constantly seeking that high. So what do? They take more of the drug. So they have to up their dose of the drug just so they can get the same rate of firing that they did when they had normal number of receptors there. And this is why people overdose. It is a mental disease. Addiction is a disease. It is not a choice. It is not. Just like HIV is a disease. But, well, look, you're going to say that HIV is a disease, right? But you're not going to say addiction is a disease. Yeah, because you chose to use that drug. Yeah, but you also chose to have sex unprotected. Does that mean that HIV is not a disease? Well, no, that's still a disease. It's no different. There's a chemical change,
Imbalance, yeah.
physical change in the brain. That's why it's a disease. And people who say that it isn't, they either don't understand it, like you good people do now, or they refuse to accept it because they were either victims of someone that they loved who had an addiction, and it's so painful that they refuse. And this is all part of what's called the defensive attribution. It's victim blaming, just because they're afraid. They're afraid to admit. Now, this is not everybody. Okay, these are people who have been told these things that I've said, who have read these things and still refuse to acknowledge it being a disease. They're employing what's called the defensive attribution. They're victim blaming just because they're afraid that it could happen to them, and they're not even aware of why they're doing it. Now, Hammer, what was your question?
Is the same thing with tolerance, like a therapeutic effect being the same? of a drug?
So
Does that make sense?
therapeutic, I don't know about a therapeutic effect, but therapeutic treatment is supposed to be something that is compensatory, meaning it's compensating for something that should be there. So what, maybe if you change the way you ask the question, I could have an idea of what that.
No, I think you just answered it. So
Okay.
it's not necessarily the same thing. Like,
No, no, I don't think so. No.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So this is just giving us some examples, right? This is giving us some little tidbits of fun facts, right? So
But this is absolutely true. The last statement on this slide is absolutely true.
right. They lack an enzyme. East Asian populations, the people in East Asia lack an enzyme to break alcohol down, and they get violently ill. And as a result, they have the lower rates of alcoholism.
Much lower.
Yeah. We find that nicotine in tobacco products activates what we call nicotinic receptors. And the only reason why they're called nicotinic receptors is because they use nicotine to find them. They literally used nicotine to find these receptor types. They're like, all right, well, let's call them nicotinic. That's the only reason why. We know that some are more stable for people than others, as in their tolerance uh, doesn't shift as much as it does for others. Some people, when they smoke, the tolerance, the receptors down regulating doesn't happen as strongly as someone who becomes addicted to nicotine.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
A child born addicted to drugs or a child born with HIV because the mother passed it through pregnancy,
Mm-hmm.
that obviously leads to they have a disease. They obviously weren't drug addicts and they obviously weren't out having sex to catch it. So I don't understand how it could be a
Uh-oh, we lost you.
yeah, I don't know. I paused because I'm trying to figure out what my question actually is. It's just like I mean, I believe that it's a disease and in all aspects.
Good.
But for the children who become, are born addicted or are born with HIV, it's
Right.
still a disease for them. So why
Yes.
why is it that we still as a society can't hear?
ignorant.
It's because they don't understand it or they refuse to accept it because they're afraid. Yep. Yep. This often happens when women are victims of rape, right? Rather than say, oh, that is really bad and I'm really sorry for you. Man, that's awful. A lot of people go, well, hey, you saw how she dressed. You know why? You know why? Because they're afraid themselves that could happen to them. Same reason. So, culture and addiction. Addiction patterns vary according to cultural practices. For example, Ireland forbids children but condones adult drunkenness, leads to higher rates of alcoholism. In some of the Mediterranean countries like Greece and Italy and France, they teach children how to drink responsibly and condemn public drunkenness. So they have lower rates. And we also know that policies of total abstinence, as in you can't do that ever, increases the rates of alcoholism. Not all addicts have withdrawal symptoms. The setting and expectations of the drug have an impact on the physiological effects of the drug. Addiction does not depend on the properties of the drug alone, but also the reasons for taking it. Are you using the drug to escape a problem, or are you using a drug to function? Looking to get high versus looking to get through the day. Okay. Dissociative identity disorder. This actually should have been before this because it's a personality disorder. formerly known as multiple personality disorder, a controversial disorder marked by the appearance within one person of two or more distinct personality, each with its own name and traits.
Why is this so controversial?
I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question.
The controversy.
It's a person having multiple personalities. Okay.
Caleb, you seen that movie?
Yeah, come on, don't. We got to get through this.
You rang.
Yes, Hammer was saying, isn't there a movie Split or something? Anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, moving on. No, moving on. Okay, so here are the two competing viewpoints, right? These are competing. This is why it's controversial. First view is that it starts in childhood as a means of coping, and then this whatever traumatic experience they're having, they create another personality that is stronger than their own to be able to cope. Okay, essentially saying that it's real. The second is that these personalities are created through pressures that are being given by the clinicians. Like they're saying that these clinicians, these therapists are saying, you have another personality, don't you? Come on, let's hear another one. And so their evidence for this is that there were a handful of diagnoses to 10,000 diagnoses in the 80s, or well, since the 80s. Sorry.
What?
So the point here is
This-
that there was a very low prevalence of people diagnosed with multiple personality disorders. But then
Yeah.
once psychologists began to study it and treat it, you saw this boom of people diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. So they thought, well, if it wasn't there before and now there are, and you're only identifying it now, then you must be the ones creating it. And that's why it's controversial. That's the critics think that it's, well, the therapists are creating it. And they're doing it by rewarding, they say, rewarding the patient. Edward Mordrake. I don't know who that is.
Yeah, I hate that. Wait, can I just see that just one more time?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Two-faced man.
Okay. All right.
Okay, hey, question.
Yes.
I just wanna appreciate the nature of these two personality. The first one is a nice man, good looking, and the personality behind is not very nice like the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Is that mean the second personality is always something we hide to the public or something like this?
No, because people diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder don't even know that they're shifting. It just happens. They'll be speaking, you would be speaking to someone and their name is John, and then the next thing you know, John hit the way the person holds themselves, like their posture, and the words they choose to use, and even accents, and in experiences from each. It's a whole different person that just comes out. So they're not actively hiding it. Okay, so here, yeah, I already covered that. So yeah, it says therapists are looking for multiple personality disorder may reward patients with attention and praise, which then reveals more personalities, is the idea. All right, moving on to schizophrenia. Okay. Schizophrenia is an interesting one. I would say you'd have to lump that one into a behavior disorder. So you have bizarre delusions, right? These false beliefs, hallucinations. You're seeing, hearing. Hearing things is the most common one, and heightened.
Sorry. when I worked at Price Chopper, I actually had to one of my customers was schizophrenic.
Mm.
She kept rambling to me, asking me to help her prove that her neighbors were serial killers.
Okay, so then that's the other one, right? So that's the bizarre delusions. And there are delusions of grandeur that we talked about earlier, but there are also delusions of persecution, which is the paranoid part. They also have disorganized, incoherent speech, meaning they don't really put words in order, and sometimes they'll just leave words out, so they don't really, you don't really, difficult to understand them. They're grossly disorganized, and they exhibit inappropriate behavior. And what that means is that they are not often they are not taking care of themselves hygienically. Um, they will scream and lash out for no reason. They will do essentially odd things, things that are queer to you. You're like, I don't understand what you're doing. Why are you taking your shirt off? It's freezing. And then there are negative symptoms. And when we say negative symptoms, it's just like when we were learning in chapter 9 about learning. Negative symptoms are symptoms where they used to do things and now they no longer. It's a loss of something. It's a loss of an aspect of themselves. For example, someone before they were diagnosed with schizophrenia loved to watch movies or play video games or listen to music. Now they don't. Or so it's a loss in one's usual activities, and also they'll experience what are called flattened affects. They're not happy, they're not sad, they're just there. They're just there.
Is this something that's diagnosed later in life?
Yeah, it's very rare to be diagnosed with schizophrenia in childhood. For men, it happens most of the time. It'll happen between the ages of 18 and 25. And for women, it's a few years later, 5 years later. So again, the delusions, odd or unusual ways of thinking that are not founded in reality. David Letterman had one fan, Margaret Mary Ray, who stalked him incessantly and thought that he was in love with her, and she was arrested outside his house and stuff. Hallucinations, false sensory experiences that feel intensely real. Again, the most common type is auditory. They're hearing voices. So what this is telling us is that, yeah, it's highly heritable. If you have an identical twin diagnosed with schizophrenia, then there's a 50% chance that you will as well. And that's what basically this is just showing the evidence for that. The closer you are in relation to someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the closest you can ever be is having an identical twin, then the higher rate of, or possibility, or likelihood of being diagnosed with schizophrenia yourself. What are some other things that can um, influence or increase the likelihood? Prenatal complications or birth complications. If there's at some point damage to the fetal brain, that increases the chance of schizophrenia, as well as other mental disorders. Um, Maternal illness. In one study, they found that their flu was going around in some. I don't want to say European. It was like northeast of Europe. So maybe that's. I don't know. I don't know. But it's not in our continent. Anyway, um, what they found was the flu was going around, and all these women who were pregnant caught the flu, and then about 20 years later, all of their children. That's not true. That's not true. But what happened is that they found that there was a 300% increase in the rate of schizophrenia. Um, so there's something about volumetric loss, because when someone has the flu, they're throwing up, they have diarrhea, that kind of thing. And there's something about volumetric loss that contributes to the development of the offspring later in life developing schizophrenia.
Why so much later? I just don't understand how.
Because that's when it comes out. That's when it takes form. So one of the precipitators for schizophrenia is high emotional stress, and most children don't experience high emotional stress until they're well into puberty.
So it has everything to do with like development.
Yes, that's correct. Yep. Also, if brain injury or oxygen deprivation occurs during birth or delivery, labor, it increases the chance of developing schizophrenia in that child as adult. Okay, so what do we know by looking at people's brains who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia? Is that it's the opposite of people who've been diagnosed with autism. See, with autism, when they look at people's brains after they died and they research them, they find that there's like too many or more connections between neurons than normal. With people diagnosed with schizophrenia, it's the reverse. It's too many that are pruned away, too few connections. It says this may explain why the first episode occurs in adolescence or early adulthood. But again, it's that vulnerability stress, right? So it may be just that, or it may be that plus high emotional stressors. In our culture, for example, and in most other cultures, it is expected that the sons leave the home when they're old enough to. And it's accepted for the most part for our daughters to stay. It has been traditionally that way.
What do they mean by that? Pruned away.
So what happens is that our neurons communicate, they form these synapses, these connections, and we go through this massive development. It's called fast mapping. Don't worry about it. When we're developing language as children, but then once we're done, we're finished kind of picking up on all like the intricacies of the world. We don't need all those connections. So we start to prune them. Pruning them means they're making less connections. They're removing some of the connections. That's what it means. And with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, there's too many pruned away. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.